My ex-fiancé left me for my sister because I was too fat for his image. 5 days later, I walked into their wedding in a wine-red dress, beside the man 300 people went silent for. The invitation smelled like perfume and nerve, gold letters on cream paper, the edges gilded so precisely they'd clearly cost someone real money to produce. The marriage of Camila Salgado and Mauricio Ledesma, my sister's name first, which told me the bride's family was paying, except of course that our family had almost nothing, which meant someone else was covering it. And the lavishness of that envelope already told me something about how the last 4 months had gone for Mauricio that I hadn't been in a position to observe directly. I set it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. My sister, my ex-fiancé. A year ago, Mauricio had asked me to marry him in the garden of my parents' home on a Sunday afternoon in April. Champagne and crystal flutes, a trio of musicians he'd hired playing something that sounded like happiness. 60 people watching, my mother crying, my father shaking Mauricio's hand with both of his. I remember thinking, in the moment I said yes and the people around us clapped, that this was what it felt like to be inside the opening scene of the life you'd been working toward. 4 months later, he invited me to a cafe near the Bellas Artes and explained. "Valeria," he said, adjusting his watch, the watch he always adjusted when he was saying something he'd rehearsed. "My career is entering a new phase. Influential circles. People who evaluate not just the man but the package around him. I need a wife who properly projects my image." A pause that he'd also clearly rehearsed. "You've put on weight. You don't dress up the way you used to. Camila understands this environment better. She's just more..." He searched for the word with the expression of a man who had already found it and was deciding whether to use it. Presentable. I remember that the coffee in front of me was still hot enough to steam. I remember the exact sound of the cafe, a chair scraping, something playing over the speakers, a conversation behind me in English that I didn't understand a word of. I remember looking at his watch, which he was still adjusting, and understanding that a person can tell you everything about themselves in a gesture that has nothing to do with words. I went to my parents' house that night to tell my mother what had happened, and I found Camila already there. Sitting at the kitchen table with Mauricio, drinking coffee, the three of them arranged the way people arrange themselves when they've been waiting for someone to arrive and have already decided how the conversation will go. "Don't make a drama out of this, mija," my mother said. "Camila is young and beautiful. You've always been the strong one. You can handle this." I took the engagement ring off my finger and set it on the kitchen table. I did it carefully, which I think surprised all of them more than slamming it would have. Then I left. I need to go back a little further to explain what the next 5 days looked like, and why I was sitting alone at a hotel bar the night before the wedding with a glass of mezcal and an invitation I'd almost thrown away. I'd been working as an independent financial auditor for 6 years by the time Mauricio proposed. Not a glamorous job by the social standards of the circles he was moving into, but a real one. The kind of work that requires precision and patience and a specific tolerance for finding things that have been hidden, which I've come to understand is a professional skill that has personal applications nobody teaches you about in the curriculum. My clients were mid-sized companies, family businesses, a few municipal contracts. I was good at it. I was thorough. My reports had a reputation for being the kind that nobody wanted to receive, but that always told you exactly what was there. Mauricio worked in real estate development, acquisitions, financing, the social architecture of getting deals in front of the right people. He was charming in the way that works in rooms where charm is currency. He dressed well. He laughed at the right moments. He had the specific confidence of a man whose ambition was larger than his bank account, but whose bank account was growing toward it, and who had learned that projecting the destination in advance was part of how you arrived. The early red flags were small enough that I named them something else every time they appeared. The first one was a dinner with his colleagues 8 months before the breakup, at which Mauricio introduced me as Valeria, she's in finance, in a tone that invited no follow-up questions and offered no details that would have invited any. I had given a presentation that week to the audit committee of a company with 900 employees and had found a discrepancy that saved them from a tax penalty that would have cost them 3 million pesos. None of this appeared in the introduction. I told myself he was nervous about mixing his professional world with his personal one. Some men are like that early in a relationship and grow out of it. I told myself this specifically on the taxi home. The second was a trip to Guadalajara for a real estate conference 4 months before the breakup, where Mauricio's colleague, Rodrigo Paz, shook my hand and said he'd heard I was very supportive of Mauricio's work, in the tone men use for a woman whose role in a man's life is understood to be ambient rather than substantive. Mauricio didn't correct him. I noticed that he didn't correct him. I told myself Rodrigo had misunderstood something at some point, and Mauricio simply hadn't gotten around to addressing it. I told myself this for 2 weeks before I stopped thinking about it. The third was a family dinner 3 months before the cafe, at which Camila wore a dress I registered, somewhere, as significant, not because of the dress itself, but because of the way Mauricio registered it, the quarter second of careful attention he gave it and then deliberately redirected, the specific disciplined motion of a man managing where his eyes went in a room where his fiancé was present. I told myself I was being paranoid, which is what I always told myself when I noticed things I didn't want to have noticed, and which is a way of making your own perception an unreliable narrator in your own story. The fourth was the cafe. You already know about that one. After the cafe, I did what I do professionally when a pattern emerges from data I hadn't initially understood was related. said. I built the timeline. 2 hours, alone in my apartment, mapping every moment from the Guadalajara conference forward. I found 11 distinct data points, 11 specific moments I had explained away individually, that, viewed as a sequence, formed a coherent picture. 11 is not coincidence. 11 is a source. And when I find 11 separate discrepancies in a financial file that all point in the same direction, I don't ask whether they're connected. I ask where the decision was made. The decision, in this case, had been made roughly 14 months before the cafe. The embezzlement started 3 months before the breakup. I understood later that the two were not unrelated, that a man who had decided to steal money to fund an ambitious lifestyle change and a man who had decided to trade his fiancée for a more presentable model were operating from the same underlying logic, which was that the resources available to him were not sufficient for the image he required, and that the solution was to take what he needed from wherever it was available. I had been one of those resources. So, as it turned out, had Damian's construction fund. I played the voice note twice. I felt something move through my chest and out through the soles of my feet, the way a thing moves through you when you finally stop holding it and let it go somewhere else. Then I went to the hotel bar, and the bar was in the Hotel Palacio Real, where the wedding reception was being held the following evening, because I had decided, sitting on my kitchen floor at 11 at night with a mezcal I'd poured for company, that if I was going to attend this wedding, I was not going to arrive having spent the night before it alone in my apartment. I was going to be here, present, not flinching. I ordered mezcal. The bartender, a professional with the specific restrained dignity of someone who has spent a decade not commenting on why people are sitting at hotel bars alone, served it without conversation, which I appreciated. I was on my second glass when the man in the suit appeared. He was the type that certain rooms produce with depressing regularity, expensive clothes worn as armor rather than as clothing, a face that expected things to move for it without asking them to, the specific confidence of a man who has never once been made to understand that other people's existence is not an inconvenience to his needs. He looked at me the way some men look at women taking up space they've decided should be available to them, with a calibrated contempt designed to land somewhere between a joke and an evaluation, deniable afterward as a misunderstanding if challenged. Mind moving, he said, with the tone of someone issuing a preference that functions as a command. I need this table for important people. A smirk I recognized as rehearsed. With a body like that, you're taking up extra space anyway. Everything went still inside me. Not the stillness of shock. I was past shock. The cafe had used up my allocation of shock for the near future, but the stillness of something that has been provoked one time too many in a very short period and has decided to stop producing a reaction. The stillness of a person who has recently been told at a cafe table by a man adjusting his watch that her body was insufficient for his requirements and who is not going to perform an emotion for another man making the same calibration in a different room. Then a voice from behind him. Apologize. One word. Deep, unhurried, the register of a man who doesn't raise his voice because raising his voice has never been necessary to produce the effect he's after. The man in the suit turned around, and I watched something happen to his face that I had not previously seen happen to the face of a man who spoke to women the way he had just spoken to me. He went white, not pale, white, the specific color that leaves a face when it recognizes a consequence it hadn't included in its planning. He apologized. He looked directly at me when he did it, not at the man behind him, at me, which told me the instruction had been given with that specificity. Then he took his important people to a different part of the bar, and the specific gravitational field he created went with him. I turned to look at the man who had spoken. Damian Robles. I knew the name before he introduced himself. There are names in Mexico City that circulate in certain contexts, not in newspaper profiles or social columns, but in the rooms where real decisions are made about who finances what and which projects proceed, and how the infrastructure of things gets built. And his was one of them, spoken carefully. Not with fear exactly, but with the awareness that the name represented something with weight. He sat down across from me, not beside me, across, which was its own piece of information, and ordered mezcal. You didn't need that, he said. No, I said, but he did. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who has just been given information they find interesting. Tell me why you're here. I don't know entirely why I told him. Maybe because I had been managing the story for 4 days, and the weight of not saying it to anyone who wasn't implicated in it had become specific and heavy. Maybe because there was something in the specific quality of his attention, not warm, not cold, just utterly present, that made the telling feel safe in a way that had nothing to do with vulnerability. I told him about Mauricio, about the cafe and the watch and the word presentable, about coming home to find my sister and my ex-fiancé drinking coffee with my mother, like the arrangement had already been settled, about the ring on the table, about the voice note, about the invitation on the kitchen counter. He listened without moving. Not the listening of a person waiting for their turn to speak, but the listening of a person who has spent considerable time learning that the information people volunteer when they're allowed to speak without interruption is usually more useful than the information they'd give you if you asked questions. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. You're going to that wedding, he said. I was going to skip it. No, he said. You're going. Not as a victim. As the woman they thought they destroyed. He looked at me steadily. There's a difference. I want to make sure you understand the difference before tomorrow. What do you get out of this? I asked. Sometimes watching an arrogant man fall is reward enough, he said. said. And then, after a pause, sometimes there are other reasons. He didn't explain the other reasons. I didn't ask yet. The dress was wine red. I'd bought it 4 months earlier, 2 weeks before the cafe, for a work event I'd attended and felt good at. The kind of event where my competence was the thing in the room rather than my appearance. I'd worn it once and put it away and not thought about it until Damien told me to wear something I felt real in. And I went into the back of my closet and found it, and stood in front of the mirror in my apartment on a Wednesday evening and understood what he'd meant. The dress didn't hide my body. It honored it. I arrived at the Palacio Real at 7:30, 1 hour after the reception had started. Damian had suggested this timing. Let the room settle, he said. Let the champagne do its early work. Then arrive when everyone has already decided the evening is what it's going to be. He met me in the lobby in a black suit, his tie the exact shade of my dress. I don't know how he'd managed the tie, and I didn't ask, because asking would have broken the specific quality of the moment, which was the quality of something that has been very carefully prepared to look effortless. We walked through the ballroom doors together. Quick pause. If you want more stories like this in better quality, my Spotify's linked in the description. 300 people turned at once. The way crowds turn when something registers in the room's peripheral awareness, and every head follows the signal before the brain has identified what it's responding to. They looked at me first. The dress, the posture, the specific quality of walking into a room as though you belong in it, which is different from the quality of walking into a room as though you're asking permission to stay. Then they saw who was walking beside me. The silence changed. It didn't deepen. It changed temperature. Mauricio froze with his champagne glass elevated, mid-sentence, the gesture of a man who had been in the middle of performing his own evening and had just encountered a variable he hadn't accounted for. Camila, in a white dress that was undeniably beautiful, went absolutely still. My mother gripped her purse with both hands. "What are you doing here with that man?" my mother said, low and urgent, her version of a hiss. She said that man in a tone that told me she knew the name and that knowing it was frightening her. "I was invited," I said. Mauricio recovered the way he always recovered, faster than he should have been able to, which had always been one of his more dangerous qualities. He smirked, the expression of a man who has decided to make a bad situation a performance. "Valeria, you look really good." "Curious," I said. "You used to call me an embarrassment." I said it loud enough for the 2 people closest to us to hear. Not loud enough for the room, just enough for the record. Halfway through dinner, Mauricio found me alone in the interior courtyard. I'd stepped out for air, genuinely, not strategically, though I won't pretend I was surprised he followed. A man like Mauricio, in the presence of something that has unsettled him, will always try to locate the private moment, the room without witnesses, the conversation where he can be more of himself because no one is watching. "I made a mistake," he said. He said it the way he said things that had been prepared to sound spontaneous. "Camilla is vain, shallow, empty. I still feel something for you, Vale. The civil paperwork isn't even fully signed." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about the cafe, the watch, the word presentable. I thought about finding him in my parents' kitchen, having coffee with my mother and my sister like an arrangement that had already been made. "You left me," I said, "because I didn't fit your image. Tonight I show up with a more powerful man, and suddenly I have value again." He had the decency to look briefly uncomfortable. Then the look passed, because Mauricio's self-awareness was always more expensive than he was willing to pay. "Robles doesn't actually care about women like you," he said. "He's using you to humiliate me." A voice from the dark part of the courtyard. "No," it said. "You manage that on your own." Damian stepped into the light. Mauricio's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, and a third thing that was closer to the expression that man at the bar had worn, the color leaving a face when it recognizes a consequence it hadn't planned for. "This is none of your business," Mauricio said. "It became my business," Damian said quietly, and quiet with him was not soft. It was the opposite of soft. It was what a thing sounds like when it doesn't need volume. "The moment you started embezzling from my construction firms to pay for this wedding." I looked at Damian. He looked at Mauricio. Mauricio said nothing, which, in a man who always had something to say, was its own statement. I want to describe what Damian's audit team had found, because I think the specifics matter. Not because specifics are dramatic. They're often the opposite of dramatic, dry, and procedural and unimpressed by their own weight, but because I understand how financial irregularities work, and what I learned later in debriefings with 2 federal investigators and an analyst from the Financial Intelligence Unit is a story of audacious stupidity rather than sophisticated crime. Gabriel Fuentes, the lead forensic accountant on Damian's internal audit team, 21 years in financial investigation, 3 years with the Auditoria Superior de la Federación before moving to private sector work, had initially flagged anomalies in the internal fund of a mid-sized construction subsidiary in April. The irregularities were consistent with the pattern of someone who understood the thresholds at which transactions would be flagged and was deliberately staying below them, not sophisticated enough to be invisible, but confident enough in their own cleverness to not imagine anyone looking closely. The amounts, over 6 months, totaled approximately 480,000 pesos. Enough, as it happened, for a 5-tier wedding cake, 300 place settings, a venue at the Palacio Real, and an invitation printed on cream paper with gold lettering that smelled like perfume and nerve. Damian hadn't known it was Mauricio until 3 weeks before the wedding, when the name on the shell company receiving the transfers resolved through a secondary corporate registry search to to a real estate entity that traced back to Mauricio's business address. At that point, the nature of the coincidence, Valeria's ex-fiancé, the wedding, the venue, became something Damian described to me later, with characteristic understatement, as interesting. He'd had the full documentation before he sat down across from me at the bar. He simply hadn't led with it. Inspector Lorena Carrasco of the Fiscalia General, 13 years in financial crimes investigation, had been in communication with Damian's legal counsel for 2 weeks before the wedding. The coordination of timing, the reception, the documentation, the moment of maximum social exposure for Mauricio was not my plan, and not, I think, primarily about me. It was about the fact that Damian's legal team had advised that a public disclosure, with witnesses in the presence of the groom himself, would substantially complicate any attempt to claim later that the irregularities were accidental or administrative. 300 witnesses are harder to contradict than a closed office. Rafael Montes, Damian's head of legal affairs, 14 years managing corporate governance and regulatory compliance, filed the formal criminal complaint the morning of the wedding. The federal investigators arrived at the reception as a matter of coordinated timing rather than dramatic choice, though I won't pretend the timing didn't have something of both. Back inside the ballroom, Damian tapped his glass with a small spoon. Once, the mariachi stopped mid-note. The projector screen behind the sweetheart table changed. Where romantic photographs of Camila and Mauricio had been cycling through, there was now a display of financial documents, bank transfers, fake invoices, shell company registrations, the specific and unglamorous architecture of money stolen in careful increments and assembled into a wedding. Camila's voice, when it came, was very small. Mauricio, what is that? Damian addressed the room without theater, the way he did everything. 3 months ago, an audit team detected irregular fund movements in an internal account. The investigation identified a pattern of transfers over 6 months, totaling approximately 480,000 pesos, routed through a series of entities to a real estate account belonging to the groom. He let that settle. The person responsible for this theft is your groom. Camila turned to Mauricio. I watched her do it. Her face moved through something private and complicated, the specific expression of a person who has just received information that reorganizes everything they were standing on. You paid for my dream wedding, she said slowly, with stolen money. You demanded this lifestyle! Mauricio's voice cracked, the performed composure gone. Your mother kept saying we had to impress everyone. We had to have the right venue, the right dress, the right— Leave me out of your crimes, my mother said from 2 tables over, with the velocity of a woman who has just decided that the narrative sinking in front of her is one she will not be aboard. I looked at my mother. She didn't meet my eyes. The oak doors at the back of the ballroom opened. Federal investigators, state police, 8 of them, in the unhurried way of people who have arrived at a place they expected to find exactly what they're going to find. They walked to the head table with the specific economy of professionals who have done this before and understand that the drama belongs to the situation and not to them. Inspector Carrasco spoke. Mauricio Ledesma, you are under arrest for grand fraud, embezzlement, and illicit financial operations. He was handcuffed in front of the 5-tier wedding cake. The tiers were decorated with white flowers that I learned later Camila had spent 3 hours selecting with the event planner. The detail seems unnecessary, and yet somehow it's the detail I remember most clearly. The flowers, white against the white frosting, and the handcuffs, and the expression on Mauricio's face, which was the expression of a man who has spent his entire adult life managing how he appears to rooms and has arrived at the moment when the room no longer requires his management. You did this to me, he shouted at me as they moved him toward the door. 300 people watching, 300 phones up. I shook my head. No, Mauricio, you did this to yourself. I just stopped covering up your shame. He started to say something else. The door closed behind him before it arrived. The mariachi, after a moment, started playing again. Someone had apparently not told them to stop permanently, and in the absence of a specific instruction to the contrary, they defaulted to the job they'd been paid to do. It was, I thought, the most accurate possible response to everything that had just happened. Camila didn't speak to me that night. She sat at the sweetheart table for a while, in her white dress, in the particular stillness of someone who has been left in a situation they don't yet have words for. I didn't approach her. There was nothing I could say that the evening hadn't already said more efficiently. My mother, at some point, left. I didn't watch her go. I was talking to a woman from Mauricio's real estate circle who turned out to have known about the embezzlement for 2 months and had been waiting for someone else to be the one to report it, which is a common dynamic in financial fraud cases, and which I found professionally very familiar. Damian and I sat at the bar until the reception staff began quietly removing the floral centerpieces. He ordered mezcal and I ordered water, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with the evening. A building he was assessing in the Roma Norte neighborhood, a case I was working on involving a manufacturing company in Monterrey, the specific satisfaction of a balance sheet that resolves cleanly after months of looking at one that doesn't. It was the most comfortable conversation I'd had in 4 months. Why did you really do this? I asked, near midnight. He considered the question the way he considered everything, without pretending the consideration was faster than it was. Mauricio was stealing from me, he said. That required a response regardless of anything else. And the anything else? He looked at me. Sometimes, he said, the right timing for a professional necessity coincides with the right timing for other things. I let that sit. The bar was emptying, the flowers were coming down down from the tables. He was wrong about you, Damian said. The image thing. He was catastrophically wrong. I know, I said. I want you to know I know it too. Mauricio Ledesma's criminal proceedings are ongoing. Inspector Carrasco's office has pursued the case with the focused efficiency of investigators who have a solid documentary record and a 300-person witness list. His attorneys have filed the standard series of delays. The trial is expected to begin within the year. Camilla has not contacted me. I don't expect her to, and I'm not sure what I would say. She was also betrayed by him with stolen money in front of 300 people at what was supposed to be the most important night of her life. That betrayal deserves its own reckoning, separate from mine. I find I have less anger toward her than I would have predicted, which I think says something about anger and where it actually belongs. My mother sent one message, 10 days after the wedding. It said, "You always had to make everything about you." I read it once and then put my phone down, and I noticed that what I felt reading it was not hurt, exactly, but something closer to the feeling you get when you finally see the architecture of a thing clearly and understand that the architecture was always this way, even when you were inside it telling yourself it was something else. I called my father. We talked for a long time. He had more to say than I expected, and it was more honest than I expected. And I'm not going to describe it here because it belongs to just us. Damian and I have had dinner 3 times since the wedding, not as a performance, as two people who found that a conversation that started in a hotel bar at the worst moment of my recent life turned out to have more to it than the circumstances that started it. Whether it becomes something else is a question that still has time to answer itself. The audit practice is doing well. I took on 2 new clients in February, one of them a referral from a contact of Damian's who had heard, through channels I didn't ask about in detail, that I was precise, thorough, and not afraid of what she finds. That last part is the most accurate description of me anyone has ever offered in a professional context. The invitation is still in my kitchen. I've thought about throwing it out and decided against it. Not as a memento of the worst things, the cafe, the watch, the word presentable, my mother's voice telling me to get over it. As a reminder of what happens when you let someone else tell you what you're worth long enough that you start almost believing them. Almost. You wear the wine red dress. You walk through the door. You do not apologize for existing. The rest takes care of itself.